Today we bring you an emotional story full of unexpected twists, where a young woman unexpectedly discovers that her entire life has been based on a great secret, a truth revealed in a shocking way, leading her to face challenges, doubts, and discoveries about her own identity. If you know or have experienced something similar, share your story in the comments. It could be the next one to inspire our subscribers. She never imagined how that day would unfold. As she sat at her desk at work, surrounded by the usual office chatter, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. Everything seemed to be moving at its usual pace, but deep down, something felt off. The phone buzzing on her desk caught her attention. When she saw the name on the screen, her heart skipped a beat. It was her mother. The urgency in her mother's voice when she picked up the phone sent a wave of panic through her. "We need to talk," her mother said, and immediately she could hear the trembling in her voice. It wasn't like her mother at all. She tried to reassure her, but the words came in a rush. "Things are not as they seem," her mother said, a strange sense of worry hanging in her voice. She kept repeating phrases like, "I should have told you before," and "We need to talk now." Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Why was her mother so panicked? Nothing had seemed out of place before that moment. She asked her mother what was going on, but she didn't get an answer. Her mother just insisted she come home immediately. At that moment, she felt something in the pit of her stomach. Fear. She couldn't focus on anything else, and as soon as she hung up, she excused herself from the office, her thoughts swirling with questions. The drive home felt like it lasted an eternity. Every familiar street looked unfamiliar now. As she pulled into the driveway, dread consumed her, and she could feel her hands shaking as she stepped out of the car. Inside, she was greeted by the sight of her parents sitting in the living room, their faces pale and drawn. It was as if the air had thickened around her. Her mother's eyes were filled with something, guilt, fear, but mostly a sense of urgency. Her father, who always appeared calm, had his gaze fixed downward. The silence between them was unbearable. She asked again, this time in a trembling voice, "What's going on?" Her parents exchanged a look, and then the truth came out. The words her parents spoke were like a punch to the stomach. They weren't her biological parents. She wasn't who she had always believed herself to be. The life she thought she knew, everything was a lie. Her identity, the very core of who she was, had been stolen. She had been adopted when she was very young, but there was more to the story. As her parents tried to explain, nothing made sense. She felt lost. Her entire world shifted in an instant. Nothing they said could undo the shock that had taken over her mind. How could they have kept this from her for so long? How could they have lived a lie with her for all these years? The pain of the truth was suffocating. She couldn't stop the flood of emotions, anger, confusion, and heartbreak. Her parents said it was all out of love, but in that moment, love didn't matter. What mattered was the truth, and it felt like it was too much to bear. The more she processed what her parents had just told her, the less she felt like herself. She had always thought of them as her rock, her foundation. They were the ones who had shaped her life, guided her through every milestone, and now, everything she thought she knew about them and her past seemed tainted. She kept replaying their words over and over in her mind, but nothing stuck. The idea that she wasn't who she thought she was, it was too much. She stood there in the living room, staring at the two people who had raised her, trying to make sense of their explanation, but it all sounded hollow. They said they'd adopted her when she was just a baby, but that wasn't the problem. The problem was that she wasn't just adopted. She had been taken, they admitted, from an orphanage when she was very young. That's when the walls around her world started to crumble. All those memories, everything she had believed about herself. Was it even real? Was it all a fabrication? They told her they had loved her from the moment they met her, and that was why they kept everything a secret. But the more they explained, the more she felt like she was being suffocated by their words. How could they have done this to her? How could they have built an entire life with her based on lies? She felt dizzy, like she was floating, but there was nowhere to go. The life she knew was slipping through her fingers, and she was left with only the cold, empty truth. Her parents, the people she trusted the most, were strangers to her now. She couldn't understand why they didn't tell her sooner, why they had waited until now, when the truth could no longer be hidden. The thought of them telling her when she was older didn't make her feel better. It only made her feel like an object, like someone they had been hiding for years. She needed answers. Answers she didn't even know how to ask. But before she could say anything more, her mother stood up, visibly shaking, and told her that they needed to leave. The urgency in her voice was like nothing she had ever heard before. It wasn't just about the truth anymore. It was about running away. But where could they go? And why was her mother acting so desperate? Nothing made sense anymore. She was spiraling into a whirlwind of confusion, fear, and anger. What was going on? Why was this happening now? Her heart raced as she followed her parents out the door, her mind struggling to catch up with the reality they were forcing upon her. She wasn't ready to leave, not yet, not until she could figure out what all of this meant. But there was no time for that now. As she sat in the back seat of the car, the reality of the situation began to settle in. Her parents were acting strangely, speaking in hushed tones as they rushed to pack their things, as if they were running away from something or someone. She could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating, the sense of urgency, the panic in their voices, the way they kept looking over their shoulders. It all felt wrong. They kept reassuring her that everything was fine, that they just needed to take a break and get away for a while. But she wasn't buying it. Her heart pounded in her chest as she glanced between her parents, both of them now avoiding her gaze. The car ride to the hotel felt like it took forever. It wasn't just the usual discomfort of being cooped up in a car. It was the silence, the palpable fear that hung between them. She tried to keep her mind busy, but her thoughts kept circling back to the same questions. What was going on? Why were they acting like this? Her mother, usually calm and collected, was visibly shaking, and her father, the man who had always been so steady, was just as tense. It was clear something had changed, but what? And why had they kept her in the dark for so long? The drive felt surreal, like she was in a dream that she couldn't wake up from. When they finally arrived at the hotel, she expected them to sit down, to talk it through and explain everything. But no. They told her to stay in the room, to watch TV and relax while they took care of some things. There was no explanation, no comfort. It felt like they were shutting her out. The room was cold, and for the first time in her life, she felt utterly alone. She tried to distract herself, flipping through channels, but her mind wouldn't stop racing. Every time she glanced at the door, it was like her heart skipped a beat. What was going on? Why had they come to this hotel, and why were they so desperate to keep her away from whatever was happening? She couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen, something that she couldn't control. And it wasn't until the phone rang that things took an even darker turn. Her mother had left her phone behind, and when it rang, she couldn't ignore it. She answered it, her hands shaking as she looked at the name on the screen. Melanie, Zoe's mom. The conversation that followed made her blood run cold. Melanie's voice was urgent, filled with concern. "Leona, where are you?" she asked. "What's going on? Your parents aren't telling me anything, but I know something's wrong." Melanie's words sent a shock through her body. How did she know? What did Melanie know that she didn't? And why was she so worried? Leona was caught in a whirlwind of confusion. She barely managed to speak, trying to explain that she was in a hotel, but before she could say anything else, the phone was ripped from her hands. Her mother stood in the doorway, her face pale, her expression filled with a fear Leona had never seen before. The call ended abruptly, and her mother's voice cracked as she said, "You shouldn't have answered that. Now they know." What did they know? What was happening? And why was everything spiraling out of control? The fear in her mother's voice was real, and it scared her more than anything else. Her heart raced, and she felt the weight of the truth pressing down on her. It wasn't just her identity that was at stake anymore, it was her life. Everything was unraveling before her eyes, and she didn't know how to stop it. The sudden rush of emotions hit her like a wave, and she felt like she was drowning in them. The truth was unraveling so quickly, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Her mind kept racing, piecing together the fragmented conversations, the strange behavior of her parents, and the nagging feeling that something far bigger was at play than she had ever imagined. She was frozen in that hotel room, her thoughts spiraling out of control. What had she just learned? What had been kept hidden from her for so long? The phone call from Melanie, her mother's reaction, the panic in her father's eyes. Everything was connected, and yet none of it made sense. The sound of footsteps outside her room made her jump, and before she could even react, the door opened. Her parents stood there, their faces tense, their eyes darting nervously. Her mother stepped inside, her voice low and strained, trying to calm her down, but Leona could see it in her eyes. Her mother was terrified. It wasn't just fear for their secret being exposed. It was fear for something else, something darker. "You need to stay calm," her mother whispered, her hands trembling as she tried to take Leona's hand. But Leona pulled back. She couldn't stay calm, not with everything she had just learned. "What's going on?" Leona demanded. "What have you been hiding from me? Why are we running away? Why are we in this hotel? What's happening?" Her mother's eyes welled with tears, and for the first time, Leona saw the woman who had always been her rock break down in front of her. "We didn't want you to know," her mother whispered, voice cracking. "We wanted to protect you. We didn't think you were ready." Her father stood in the doorway, his face pale and eyes wide with a mix of shame and fear. Leona's heart began to race even faster as she realized that her parents weren't just keeping a secret about her identity. They were hiding something far more dangerous. Her mother's hands shook as she spoke again. "You were never supposed to know, but the truth, it's out now. They know who you are. And they're coming for us." The blood drained from Leona's face as she struggled to comprehend what her mother had just said. "Who is coming for us?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Who are you talking about?" Her mother's eyes filled with a terror that Leona had never seen before. "The people who took you," her mother said softly. "The ones who wanted you back." Leona's mind reeled, and she felt a chill run down her spine. The people who took her? What did that mean? Who were these people? And why were they coming for her now? The answers she had been searching for felt just out of reach, like a puzzle she couldn't solve. All she knew was that her life was about to change forever, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Her world had been shattered, and in that moment she understood that nothing would ever be the same again. The fear, the confusion, the uncertainty, everything she had ever known was slipping away. And all she could do now was wait for the next bombshell to drop. The tension in the room was so thick she could almost taste it. Leona's heart was pounding in her chest as her mother's words echoed in her ears. "The people who took you." The thought sent a wave of cold through her veins. She felt like she was trapped in a nightmare she couldn't wake up from, each piece of the puzzle slipping further away as new pieces were revealed, none of them making sense. Her mother, usually so composed and calm, was now shaking, her voice cracking with fear as she explained that the people who had taken Leona when she was just a baby had finally found them. Leona's mind couldn't quite grasp the magnitude of what her mother was saying. Who were these people? Why had they taken her? And why was this happening now after all these years? The fear was palpable in the air. Her mother's voice was strained as she tried to reassure her. "We've kept you safe all these years," her mother said, her eyes desperate. "We did everything we could to protect you from them. But now, they're coming. We have to leave. We have to run." Leona's body felt frozen, her mind unable to comprehend the full extent of the danger they were in. She tried to ask more questions, but each answer felt like another weight on her shoulders. Her father, who had been silent up until that point, finally spoke up. "It's too dangerous to stay," he said, his voice low and tense. "They've found us. They know where we are." Leona could hear the fear in his voice, and for the first time she realized that her parents were just as scared as she was. They weren't just hiding something from her, they were hiding to protect her from something far worse. But what was it? What had they been protecting her from all this time? The questions burned in her chest, but there were no answers. Her mother hurriedly packed their bags, and Leona's mind spun trying to catch up with everything that was happening. She didn't know what to believe anymore. Her entire life had been a lie, and now she was being forced to flee, without understanding the full reason why. The fear and confusion were suffocating. Everything she had known, everything she had believed about her identity, her parents, her life, it was all unraveling. The hotel room felt smaller and smaller with each passing second. She had to leave, but she didn't know where they were going or what would happen once they left. Her father seemed to be taking charge now, his movements quick and urgent, as though they were racing against time. "We have to go now," he said. Leona's mind was still reeling from the shock of her mother's revelation, but she couldn't ignore the urgency in her father's voice. She grabbed her coat and followed them out of the room, her thoughts scattered, her body moving on autopilot. The world outside the hotel was dark and the streets felt unfamiliar, like they were in a completely different city. Her parents hustled her into the car and the drive was silent, each of them lost in their own thoughts, too scared to speak. The sense of urgency only grew with every passing minute. Leona's heart was racing again, but this time it wasn't just confusion. It was fear. Real fear. Fear of the unknown. Fear of what was coming. And she didn't know how much longer she could hold it together. All she could do was sit in the backseat of the car, staring out the window at the blurry streets, hoping that whatever was coming would leave them alone. The car ride felt like it lasted forever. Leona's mind was in overdrive, but no matter how many times she tried to make sense of everything, it just wouldn't add up. Her mother and father were on edge, whispering to each other in hushed tones as though they were constantly looking over their shoulders. Her own thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion, trying to grasp the enormity of what she had just learned. The fact that her entire life had been a lie was bad enough, but now they were running, fleeing from something she couldn't even fully understand. Her identity, her very sense of self, was being ripped apart, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Leona glanced out the window, her heart heavy, and watched the city pass by, now feeling like a place she didn't even recognize. The streets, the houses, the familiar corners, they all looked so different, as if she were seeing them for the first time. The city that had always been home now felt cold and distant. It was a place where she didn't belong, a place where everything was slipping through her fingers. As the car continued on, her father spoke up, breaking the silence that had settled over them. "We're almost there," he said, but his voice lacked the usual calm confidence that Leona was used to. It sounded strained, filled with anxiety. Leona barely nodded in response. The fear was overwhelming, making it hard to focus on anything other than the knot in her stomach and the sense of impending doom that seemed to hang in the air. She glanced at her mother, who was sitting in the front seat, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She could see the worry in her mother's eyes, and for the first time, Leona realized just how terrified she truly was. Her mother had always been the one who kept everything together, who made everything seem safe, but now she looked like a different person. The woman who had always been her rock was shaken, and that frightened Leona more than anything else. They turned onto a dark, unfamiliar road, and Leona noticed that the lights from the city were fading. The world outside the car seemed to grow darker, more isolated. It felt like they were driving deeper into an unknown, dangerous territory, and with every mile, her sense of dread grew. She wasn't sure what was waiting for them at the end of this drive, but the thought of it sent a chill down her spine. Was it the people her mother had mentioned? The ones who had taken her as a child? Or was there something even worse waiting for them? She couldn't shake the fear that whatever was coming would change everything again, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to face it. Her heart was pounding now, the noise in her ears deafening. She wanted to ask her parents what was going on, but she already knew. They didn't have the answers either. They were just as lost, just as terrified as she was. They had been running for so long, and now they were finally cornered. Leona could feel the weight of the truth pressing down on her with every passing second. It was a burden she wasn't ready to carry, but it was one she had no choice but to face. The car finally came to a stop, and the moment the engine turned off, an eerie silence enveloped them. Leona's heart raced as she looked around. They had stopped in a desolate, poorly lit parking lot, the shadows stretching out in every direction. There was no one around, no sign of life, just empty buildings and the cold, oppressive quiet of the night. Her father didn't waste any time. He quickly unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the door, motioning for her to follow. Leona hesitated, her mind spinning, but she didn't have a choice. She followed her parents out of the car, her legs shaky beneath her. Her mother was ahead of them, walking briskly with an intensity Leona hadn't seen before. There was a palpable sense of urgency in her every step, as though time was running out. The cold night air hit Leona as she stepped outside, and she instinctively wrapped her arms around herself for warmth. But it wasn't just the chill of the weather that made her shiver. The coldness in the air was coming from somewhere deeper, something that had settled inside her chest. As they approached a building in the distance, her mother and father spoke in hushed tones again. But this time, it wasn't just fear. They were talking with a sense of finality, like they were preparing for something that couldn't be avoided. Leona's questions kept swirling in her head, each one louder than the last, but she couldn't bring herself to ask them. She had a sense that whatever was about to happen, it wasn't something she would have any control over. She couldn't help but wonder why they had come here, why this place, why now. As they reached the entrance to the building, her mother turned to her, her face pale and strained. "Leona," she began, her voice trembling. "I need you to stay close to us. No matter what happens, you have to stay with us. Do you understand?" Leona nodded, her throat tight. She didn't understand, but she wasn't about to argue. Whatever was happening, her parents were determined to keep her safe, and she had no choice but to trust them. As they walked inside, the coldness of the building seeped into her bones. It wasn't a hotel. It wasn't a place for comfort. This was something else entirely. A place meant for hiding, for protection, for survival. They moved quickly through the dark hallways, and Leona's pulse quickened as the sound of their footsteps echoed off the walls. There was no turning back now. Whatever they were running from, whatever danger was coming for them, it was closing in fast. Her mind raced with questions, but her body moved on instinct, following her parents down a hallway that seemed to stretch on forever. She couldn't shake the feeling that every step they took was one closer to something she wasn't ready to face. And as they reached a door at the end of the hall, she realized with a sinking feeling that they weren't just trying to escape. They were preparing for something far more dangerous, something she couldn't possibly comprehend. The door creaked open, revealing a small, dimly lit room. Leona's eyes adjusted to the low light, and her heart seemed to skip a beat. The room wasn't what she expected. It wasn't an escape, a sanctuary, or a place of safety. It felt cold, sterile, almost clinical. There was a single table in the center, and around it several figures sat, their faces shadowed in the gloom. Leona's parents stepped inside first, moving quickly, as though they were expected. Her mother gave Leona a quick, reassuring glance, but it did little to calm the storm of questions swirling in her mind. Who were these people? What was going on? Her parents seemed tense, their movements rushed and urgent as they exchanged a few quick words with the figures at the table. Leona stood by the door, unsure whether to step inside or wait outside, but there was no time to hesitate. Her mother gently took her hand, leading her into the room. The door closed behind them with a heavy thud. One of the figures at the table, a tall man with sharp features, looked up as they entered. His expression was unreadable, but there was something about him that felt cold and calculating. He studied Leona for a moment, and she felt the weight of his gaze on her, as though he were sizing her up. Then, without a word, he motioned for them to sit down. Her parents didn't protest. They sat beside each other, and Leona, feeling a mix of fear and confusion, sat between them. The man at the table stood up and walked over to a cabinet, pulling out a file. Leona could feel her pulse racing as he flipped through the papers. She didn't know what was happening, but the air in the room had thickened and the unease was suffocating. Finally, the man spoke. "We know who you are," he said, his voice low and steady. "And we know what you've been told. But the truth is much darker than what your parents have led you to believe." Leona's stomach churned. She wanted to speak, to demand answers, but the words wouldn't come. The man continued, his tone almost clinical as he laid out the facts. "You were never meant to be here," he said. "You were taken, and now the people who took you want you back." Leona's world tilted once again. Her parents, the people she had trusted her whole life, hadn't just kept a secret about her identity. They had been running from people who had taken her as a child, and now those same people were coming for her. She felt a wave of nausea rise in her throat as the implications of what the man had said began to sink in. They weren't just hiding from the truth. They were hiding from a past that she had never known. Her parents had lied to her for her entire life, and now they were trapped in a dangerous web of deceit. Leona couldn't breathe. She couldn't process what was happening. Her parents, looking at her with desperate eyes, seemed to be waiting for her to understand. But how could she? How could anyone understand this? The man's next words were even more chilling. "We need to keep you safe. The people who took you are close. They know you're here and they'll stop at nothing to get you back." And just like that, the horror of everything hit her all at once. The truth, no matter how painful, was inescapable. Her life, everything she had known, was a lie. And the people who had taken her as a baby were about to show up, and they would stop at nothing to take her back. Leona didn't know what to do. The room seemed to close in on her, and she was overwhelmed by the weight of it all. There was no escape. The past was coming for her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The finality of everything hit her with an unbearable force. Leona sat there in that cold, dim room, surrounded by strangers who knew the truth about her life, but she still had no answers. Her heart was racing in her chest and her thoughts were a blur. The man's words echoed in her mind, repeating over and over again. "The people who took you want you back." She wanted to scream, to shout, to make it all stop, but she couldn't. There was no fighting this, no running away. Her entire life had been a lie, and now the truth was coming to collect her. But just as she thought she couldn't take any more, something in her shifted. She looked at her parents sitting beside her, their faces filled with fear and regret. They hadn't done this to her on purpose. They had loved her, they had raised her, and no matter what their mistakes had been, they had done it out of love. For the first time, Leona realized that their love, though built on deception, had been real. They had kept her safe for as long as they could, and now they were doing everything in their power to protect her from the danger that loomed ahead. It wasn't the kind of protection she had imagined, but it was the only kind they could offer. She took a deep breath and wiped her eyes, feeling the weight of everything she had just learned. The room felt smaller, the air thicker, but in that moment, she made a decision. She wasn't going to let fear control her. She wasn't going to be a victim of her past. Whatever was coming, whatever truth was left to uncover, she would face it head on. Her parents' faces softened as she made eye contact with them. For the first time, she saw not just fear in their eyes, but a glimmer of hope. They didn't have all the answers, but they were in this together. They had made it this far, and together they would find a way through it. The path ahead was unclear, the future uncertain, but Leona knew one thing for sure. Her life had changed forever, and with that change came the power to rebuild it, piece by piece, day by day. She wasn't just going to survive this. She was going to reclaim what was hers. The past could no longer define her. She would find her own way, even in the face of the unknown.